Hi there and welcome to my channel. Today we are making a one-pot beef stew. I have already prepared my ingredients and I like to cut my vegetables fairly large for a stew because I like it to be chunky, whereas if I'm making a soup then I like them to be diced a little bit smaller because I'm more likely to eat that with a spoon, whereas I may eat my stew with a fork and a spoon. Now, I want you to learn from my mistake here, and I'm always willing to admit my mistakes. I didn't pat my meat dry before I put it into the hot oil, and instead of getting a nice sear on the outside, it was busy bubbling out the moisture that came in with the beef. Just give it a pat dry with some paper towels before you add it to the pot, and then you'll get a nice crust, and it'll spend less time working out that moisture. However, even though I messed that step up, the water did eventually dissipate from the meat and the oil was still there. The meat wasn't quite browned crispy like I wanted it, but that's okay. It still turned out quite delicious. I now add the garlic and the onions to the pan and the salt and pepper. In this stage, the onions that I'm adding are quite large, but don't worry, those little slices do break up, so you still have a nice piece of onion. It's just not quite as big. Once my onions are cooked to mostly translucent, I add my flour. So at this point, I'm making a roux, and because this is a stew, I am adding quite a bit of flour to this. So to this pot of about 1.5 pounds of stew meat, I added 1/3 of a cup of flour. I add it a little bit at a time and give it a good stir. And I push it a little bit further than I would normally for just a gravy. I added more and more flour. The nice thing about cooking beef stew in a pot versus a crock pot is that you can always thin out your stew in the pot, and you can always thicken it pretty readily. I found that when I cook stew in a crock pot, I'm almost always unhappy when I go to make my homemade thickener versus, say, adding a can of golden mushroom soup or mushroom soup to it. Now I'm adding my beef stock to it. I have 1 liter of beef stock there. You can see that the flour is starting to separate from the meat and the onions. And I quickly add the next bit of liquid before that first initial paste that forms starts to get kind of clumpy. And as you can see, the flour is incorporated in there perfectly. I add the rest of my stock. Because our beef doesn't have a lot of marbling to it, this needs to cook in the pot for about 1.5 hours before I even add any other vegetables. So I added some fresh bay leaves from my tree and some rosemary and fresh thyme. As those herbs cook, I just take the stalks out because the little petals have all fallen off. After about 1.5 hours of simmering like this, I add the vegetables into the pot. And I cook those for another 30 to 40 minutes until the potatoes are cooked all the way through. Instead of adding the tomato paste, which hurts my stomach because of the acidity level, I add tomato juice to mine. I also added Worcestershire sauce and about 1/2 cup of port red wine. It's a fortified red wine that's also a little bit sweet. This gives your stew great flavor. It gives it like a rich, deep flavor and it works so wonderfully with the rosemary. In no time at all, that's bubbly and ready to serve. I served this up with a couple of pieces of sourdough bread that was fresh, and the family was making happy noises when I was in the office. I love soup season and stew season, and I can't think of a better way to use our homegrown produce and meat than to be able to serve up something that is just absolutely so fresh. It came from our garden, it came from our field, and it's going into our food. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Until next time, bye for now.